Welcome, everyone. My name is Mary, and I am with the People's Forum. Thank you for joining us. The People's Forum is a space for revolutionary education and culture. And though our physical space is currently closed, we are happy to be continuing our programming online. Before we begin, a reminder that if you need interpretation to Portuguese, please join the Zoom call. You can get the link by registering for the event on the TPF website. In a few minutes, we will activate interpretation for this event. And if you're using the Zoom application, you will see a globe icon at the bottom of your screen. To listen to the interpretation, click on the globe and select Portuguese. If you have any questions, you can submit them using the Q&A function on Zoom or comment in the YouTube or Facebook chat. We are honored to host this important conversation today on the anniversary of the day we lost a revolutionary leader, Marielle Franco. To this day, we have not had justice, and her murderers are still free, and the persecution of activists and organizers continue. Thank you to Defend Democracy in Brazil for organizing this important conversation today. I will pass it on to Natalia, who will get the conversation started.
Uma nota em português para todos que estão assistindo. A Rita acabou de apresentar o People's Forum e ela mencionou que se você precisar de... O evento será em inglês, se você precisar de interpretação, tradução, agora no Zoom você pode participar com existe um ícone de um globo para interpretação e você pode escolher entre inglês e português. Também, se você está no YouTube e não está ouvindo, não estiver ouvindo a interpretação, você pode ir na página do Defend Democracy in Brazil, no Twitter ou no Facebook, e lá existe um link, se você não registrou antecipadamente, existe um link para você ir para o Zoom, onde existe interpretação. So, hi, welcome everybody. My name is Natalia de Campos. I was just giving a note on the translation feature for Portuguese speakers. I'm a member of the Defend Democracy in Brazil Committee in New York. And first, I just wanted to thank our activists and speakers for today's program, and the immense support from the People's Forum, in particular to Rita, who's here in our tech, Layan, who is from the Education Department, Belen from the Marketing Department, and Mary, who's here with us, also introducing. The People's Forum is an amazing space in New York, if you don't know it, of which we are proud members, and which is a real hands-on supporter of groups like the DDB. Which is fighting for democracy, socialism, and for the working class, and much more. So check out their website for the amazing programs that they offer. Together, we prepared this panel to remember Marielle's legacy, and very importantly, to know that currently, many activists and progressive politicians are persecuted simply for their ideas and their defense of human and political rights. We are here today for them, and we'll present ways in which you can participate, donate, and share their important campaigns. Yesterday, we did a beautiful ritual in the Prospect Park in Brooklyn to honor Marielle and remember other fatal victims of political persecution like her. Thanks to Miriam, Fatima, and Imani for preparing a beautiful ritual. You can check out the images and videos on our social media pages. I want to introduce our moderator, Juliana Valente, who is a member of Defend Democracy in Brazil. And she's a PhD candidate in anthropology at the CUNY Graduate Center. And before coming to the US, Juliana worked for several years at an NGO in Brazil with youth who committed crimes. Her current research is focused on issues related to human rights, to crime, to violence, and youth in Brazil. Juliana will introduce each of our speakers, but first we want to start with a message from Marielle Franco, Marielle Franco's sister, and the director of the Marielle Franco's Institute, which she sent us this Friday. As you know, today is the 3rd anniversary of Marielle's assassination, and so they are holding a number of events and asked us to use the hashtag Março por Marielle e Anderson, that's March for Marielle and Anderson, who was her driver. Thank you, Adriana Machado, for helping to put the video together. And for today's event, we're also asking you to use the following hashtags: remembering Marielle NY for New York, Justice for Marielle, and National Committee for Justice in Denver, and the Defend Democracy in Brazil. So welcome, and now we're going to watch the video.
Oi, eu sou Marielle Franco, irmã de Marielle e atual diretora do Instituto Marielle Franco. Esse instituto ele é dirigido por minha família e nasce de um episódio de violência política brutal, o qual ainda a gente não tem resposta e que completa 3 anos nesse domingo. Bom, o crime contra a Marielle Anderson, ele expõe as rachaduras e lacunas estruturais do que a gente pode chamar de uma frágil democracia brasileira. O assassinato de Marielle, eleita com um histórico de luta em defesa da vida da população negra e favelada do Rio de Janeiro, representou o extremo que a violência política contra mulheres negras pode chegar. Nossa luta por justiça, desde março, esteve associada à pressão das autoridades públicas brasileiras, na ida a instâncias internacionais na mobilização de milhares de pessoas globalmente, na articulação de movimentos e organizações de sociedade civil pelo Brasil e pelo resto do mundo. O nosso instituto ele tem como pilar defender a memória, espalhar o legado, lutar por justiça e regar as sementes de Marielle e vem tentando mover estruturas do sistema político brasileiro. Acreditamos que o fazer Marielle é uma ferramenta potente e a diretriz que nossas mandatas e políticas públicas precisam se inspirar no Brasil. Lançamos no ano passado a Agenda Marielle Franco, uma agenda política de compromissos e políticas que mandatos de todo o Brasil poderiam assinar e se comprometer para levar à frente o legado da minha irmã. Além disso, estamos firmes lutando contra as consequências da Covid-19 na população negra, favelada e periférica. E produzindo uma pesquisa, expertise, advocacy e narrativas sobre o problema da violência política no Brasil e no resto da América Latina. Agradeço a mobilização de todos e convido a quem não apoia ainda o Instituto Marielle Franco que comece. Vocês podem encontrar formas de participação no nosso site, apoiem.institutomariellefranco.org, seja uma doação física ou se tornar voluntário. Como a Mari entrou nas galerias da Câmara, lutamos para que nunca ninguém mais tente nos interromper, porque não seremos interrompidas.
Thank you and welcome everyone. My name is Juliana Valente and I'm honored to serve as mediator during this important conversation with key activists on the front line. Natalia is interpreting us right now. So Marielle was one of a kind. She was powerful and determined to fight for justice, but her assassination, however, was not unique. I hope that today, by honoring her memory, that we can think through some of the ways in which activists are faced with having to protect their own lives in order to protect the lives of others. I believe a major motivator for us at Defend Democracy in Brazil is also to consider what can we do to aid the struggles of our comrades, our brothers and sisters, our companheiros de luta. We will hold a Q&A after hearing from everyone on the panel. So if you have questions for speakers, please place them in the Q&A when the option appears. Rita Anderson will also be compiling questions placed on YouTube. A reminder that if you need Portuguese interpretation, it is available on the Zoom webinar, but not on YouTube. Lembrete que se você precisa de tradução para o português, estamos traduzindo no webinar do Zoom, mas não pelo YouTube. To begin, I would like to present Damien Platt, and Ilion will be interpreting this section into Portuguese on our channel. Damien Platt is the author of Nothing by Accident, Brazil on the Edge, which was published in 2020, a book that discusses the operation of violence in Rio de Janeiro and how it intersects with organized crime, corruption, and politics. He has worked to defend disadvantaged communities in Brazil since 1996, including 8 years at Amnesty International. In 2005, he relocated to Rio de Janeiro, initially to work for Afro-Reg, a favela-based youth and culture organization, which he described in his book, Culture is Your Weapon. Later, he teamed up with TED Prize-winning French artist JR to work on his Women Are Heroes project in Rio. In 2019, he mobilized a team of local and international volunteers to build a world-class skate park in the Maré Favela complex. He is currently speaking to us from Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome, Daniel.
Hi, Juliana. Thank you for the introduction. So what I'd like to do is start just by showing a few images, because we're here to remember Marielle. Before that, I just wanted to thank the People's Forum and Defend Democracy in Brazil for organizing today. And yeah, I'm very happy to be part of this international mobilization to remember Marielle and to defend her legacy. So I'm just going to share some images, which are photos, because I knew Marielle quite well. We were friends since probably 2006, more or less since I moved to Rio. Because I first remember her, she was working on let me get some photos while let me get the photos up while I talk. So share my screen. So this is a photo of Marielle, that's in 2011. I first met Marielle in about 2006 when she was working on a campaign to stop use of the police armored car, which is called the Caveirão in Rio's favelas, which was leading to an escalation in violence at the time. And from then we remained pretty good friends, and I saw a lot of Marielle over the next 10 years, really. Because I lived in Rio until 2016 permanently. Then I moved out of the city for a couple of years, but I was still going back. So actually the last time I saw Marielle, she was just launching her campaign to become a councillor. And I saw her and I was amazed at the change from the young woman I knew from grassroots work to this woman who was just embarking on a political career. And as always, she was super charismatic, but it was like Marielle times 10, which I saw. And from what I observed of her career, she was always growing, always growing, always growing. So it's very sad that she got stopped so early on, and very important that we continue to remember what she did, who she was acting for, and more importantly, or just as importantly now, to try and discover who it was behind the assassination. So just find another picture here. Here's another photo. I just like these, as we're remembering Marielle today, I'd like to share a couple of photos. This was from her wedding in 2010. It was a very nice day. It was one of my happiest days that I spent in Rio. And there she's being walked in by her father. And on the far left of the photo is Luyara, her daughter. And this is another photo from the wedding, which I like a lot. And even though she's separated from her husband a few years later, who's in the photo, they stayed very close, and he was maybe one of her main advisors, especially once she started her political career. And they used to have more or less weekly meetings. And he told me that he saw Marielle a few days before she was killed, and that they covered almost everything that she was worried about at the time, especially relating to her professional life. And he said to me that very clearly, one thing that she never mentioned was she never had fears for her own safety. She never felt threatened. And that's very important, really, when we're trying to think about who killed her and why. And what her assassination has done is it's shone a light, as Aniele said, onto cracks and fissions in Brazilian society. And it's really shone a light onto powerful structures that sustain violence and organized crime in the city, which are never spoken about in mainstream discourse, really. So the standard narrative that we might hear about Rio is of this very violent situation, a war on drugs. that always focuses on favelas as sources of criminality, and that engenders high levels of violence and militarization of the poorest communities in the city. So this photo is taken in 2014, and that was in the run-up to the World Cup, and that when the Brazilian army took over the Maré favela complex, which is where Marielle grew up. This is probably about 10 minutes walk from the neighborhood where she grew up, and you can see in the background bullet holes in buildings. So the army was sent in to occupy this area. That stretch of streets actually on the front line, where you have rival criminal gangs who dispute territory. But what this war on drugs narrative also does is sort of obscure what is really happening in the city as well. It's a sort of fog of war type situation where no one really knows what's going on, and there's always continuous violence, but which actually is sustained by all sorts of economic interests, illegal markets, and control of territory as well. But what I have tried to do for many years is to try to understand the deeper structures related to rule of law in the city, and also to look outside. I got very tired when I was doing my human rights work and my favela work. It was very tiring after a while to see that the favela is continuously and permanently stigmatized as being a source of violence and a source of crime and the source of everything that's wrong with the city. So I started trying to look outside this to try and understand better how rule of law was operating and how that applied to the city at large. And I began to investigate a very traditional form of organized crime in Rio and Brazil, which is related to an illegal lottery, which is like a numbers racket in the USA. It's almost 130 years old, and it's been illegal for nearly all of that time. It's based on animals because it was originally designed to raise funds for a zoo in the city, and it's called in Brazilian O Jogo do Bicho, and which would translate roughly as the game of the animal into England. And as you can see, animals are designated numbers, and you can go and bet on any number you choose, and there are betting points all across the city. And you can bet 7 days a week, and there are 4 lottery draws a week. So it's very ingrained in Brazilian culture. It's very much part of the social fabric in the city. And for the last 50 or so years, it's been run by a mafia-style cupola, they're called, and who basically took over organization of the lottery in the 1960s and 70s, carved the city up into territories, and they have very strong connections to the military dictatorship. And what they also did was they became a sort of superior force to police in the city. So in order to run the lottery in a certain territory, they would pay the police to turn a blind eye, to not get involved and to not oppress them. And also politicians would also protect them. So they sort of became immersed with the state over the years. And the people who organize the lottery, those are ticket results. That's on the left is a ticket result slip, and these are posted up. You can find them posted up all over Rio. As well as organizing the lottery, they also run illegal gambling, because gambling is illegal across Brazil. So this also includes electronic gambling machines, casinos, bingos. So you imagine huge illegal markets, a huge amount of money and a huge amount of power and influence. As if this wasn't enough, the cupola who run this, they also run the Rio Carnival. They run the official parade, the very famous parade with the samba schools is run by them. And they act as patrons of the individual samba schools, while they have a committee that organizes the overall parade. So in terms of how, why we need to understand this, it's because like for years, people have talked about crime in Rio as a favela problem. But really to talk about Rio and not talk about this organized crime, the jogo do bicho, the families who run this activity, is a bit like talking about Sicily without talking about the Cosa Nostra. They're that powerful in the structure of the city and also across Brazil. Why is this important? In terms of Marielle's assassination and understanding what might lie behind it, it's important because the man on the left is a man called Ronnie Lessa. He is currently detained and charged with firing the shots that killed Marielle. And on the right, you have another well-known assassin in Rio who's called Adriano Da Nobrega. Both of them are believed to be linked to, well, they both worked as killers for the Jogo do Bicho clans. So they were both people well known to work as assassins and enforcers for these mafia-style clans that work in the city. They were also linked to a death squad called the Crime Office, which is or was a very high-level group of assassins who were operating with protection. And why were they protected? Because they worked for the Jogo do Bicho operators. And this came out quite early on in the investigation into Marielle's killing, when you had a sort of, someone was framed, and when the pressure was put on him, he made a statement to investigators saying that there is a group of killers acting in the city, and the Jogo do Bicho pays money for these killers to be able to act. And when that collapsed, it led to the Crime Office, it led to these men. Also, what is equally alarming is that the man on the right, called Adriano Da Nobrega, has very long-standing links with the Bolsonaro family. So he was a commando policeman. They're both former policemen also, to understand the fluidity between Rio's police forces and organized crime. And Adriano Da Nobrega was well known as a sharpshooter, and he was known as a sniper. And in 2002, he was arrested and charged with committing an extrajudicial execution of a criminal suspect. And while he was in detention, Jair Bolsonaro gave a speech defending him in Congress, and Flavio Bolsonaro, the president's oldest son, went and visited him while he was detained to give him an award, to give him Rio's highest honor. He actually visited him in detention to give him the award, to make the political statement that we are with you, we will stand by you. This was in about 2002. Subsequently, Nobrega left prison. He carried on working for Jogo do Bicho as an assassin. He was eventually expelled from the police force. And during this time, it's emerged that Flavio Bolsonaro gave his wife and his mother a job. He actually employed them. Whether they actually worked for him or not is another matter, because there's a corruption scheme linked to the president's son where he's believed to hired what they call ghost employees, no-show employees. And it seems that Nobrega's family might have been among that group. So what this all shows us is that there are some very uncomfortable links between the people who killed Marielle, the people who were behind the killing, and links to very long established mafia-style traditions in the city, and also links to the presidential family. Now, I'm not saying that it was the Cúpula do Jogo do Bicho or it was the Bolsonaro family that ordered the killing, but whoever did had access to these spheres of organized crime within the city. So the top levels and people who'd enjoyed acting with impunity because of high-level corruption at the highest levels inside the system in Rio. So I'll stop there. I hope that's not a lot of too much information, because it's quite complex for people who don't know about the city. I've tried to break it down into something simple, but I think what it's helping us to understand is that, as Aniele said, Marielle's killing has revealed all these structural fissures and these cracks in Brazilian society, which we need to keep paying attention to. And that's why it's so important that we need to carry on trying to discover who killed Marielle and why. Thank you.
Damien, thank you. And we know all of you have a lot to say, and 15 minutes just isn't fair. But I thank you very much. Next up,
thanks. I hope I didn't go over too much.
No, you were perfect. You were spot on. Thank you. Next up, we're going to hear from Sara Branco, and Natalia will be interpreting Sara's presentation to the Portuguese. Sara Branco is a human rights lawyer advocating for the promotion of racial and gender equality. She is a project assistant and legal advisor at the Center of Studies of Labor Relations and Inequalities, which is the CEERT, a 30-year Brazilian Black organization. She is also a member of the Brazilian Black Coalition for Rights. This is Damien's alarm. She is also the member of Brazilian Black Coalition for Rights, and she is currently based in São Paulo, Brazil. Sara, you have the floor.
Thank you, Juliana. I'll share my screen. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, Sara, we can.
Okay. So I would like to first start thanking and also congratulating the Defend Democracy in Brazil and the People's Forum for organizing this amazing and important event. And for me, it's an honor to be here with you today. To discuss the memory of Marielle Franco and her legacy, I decided to bring a conversation about the historical persecution of Black Brazilians in Brazil. And the reason for that is that even though a lot of Black people who are victims of the state are not activists, we know that racism is a political issue as well. It's a dispute of power, right? So that's why I decided that would be important also to bring this narrative about the Black Brazilian persecution here in Brazil. So I would like to go back in the history a little bit and talk about the dictatorship and how Afro-Brazilians, we played an important role in dictatorship. And the reason for that was that during the period of time, the idea of racial democracy, which would be the idea of all the races, indigenous, Black and white people, live in harmony in Brazilian society, that was a very strong at the time. So it was the idea of like the miscegenation, and there was international propaganda of the dictatorship, saying, oh, there's no racism in Brazil, everybody get along, it's not an issue for us. And at the same time that was happening, when it comes to in the governmental level, there was an anti-racism movement here in Brazil denouncing the racial issues that Black Brazilians were facing. So there was this attempt from the regime to silencing our voices. And also there was this fear of the civil rights movement in the United States. So at the time we had activists, connecting to the Black Panther, Martin Luther King, Muhammad Ali. We knew what was happening there. And there was this fear of the escalation of the discussion on racism in the US would become the same thing here in Brazil. So we had a lot of Black leaders disappeared, being murdered in the time. Also, one thing that is important is that we had a lot of samba lyrics, so being censored, and samba is an Afro-Brazilian culture, right? So at the period of time, not only Bossa Nova and other artists, which were the majority of them that we know in the mainstream were white, but also Black sambistas, which were the ones who sang and wrote samba lyrics, were persecuted as well. And they had to change the lyrics and they were prohibited of singing and all of that. And the lyrics were about race, so they were denouncing the racism in the Brazilian society. One example of them is Alisso Simoneau. He was one of the biggest singers that Brazil had at the time, but he wrote a lyric as a tribute to Martin Luther King in the racial struggle in the US. And because of that, literally his career ended. So even today, nobody knows who Wilson Simoneau was. And we understand that the reason why he was silenced in a way that nobody remembers him was because he was Black, you know. So Wilson Simoneau is an example. Abdias Nascimento, which is a historical figure for the Black movement, such an important person for us. And he was one of the founders of the Unified Black movement here in Brazil. He had to leave the country and went to the United States in dictatorship because he was also persecuted. So these are, when it comes to dictatorship, it's important to highlight that Black Brazilians, we played an important role in the period of time, and how the regime, pushed the agenda of racial democracy here, denying the existence of racism in the country. And then we move forward to democracy and social control. And the reason why I'm saying social control is because even though the dictatorship has ended, we know that there is still this attempt of the state on controlling Black people's body, right? So 1988 is the mark of the beginning of the democracy in Brazil, is our federal constitution. So that's why I put 1988. So the heritage of dictatorship employing Black communities. And it's interesting because Damien mentioned in his statement the illegal lottery, the gambling, and the animal game, right? Jogo do bicho. And that's exactly how it started. It started in the dictatorship, So that's one of the heritage of the dictatorship and criminal organized crime. I'm sorry, was in the period of time with the gambling, the illegal gambling. Besides that, also torture, disappearances, extrajudicial executions. There are things that is still happening here in Brazil, even though there is no dictatorship anymore, but Black people, Black and poor people in the communities, they deal with this every single day. Also, another important point that I would like to bring when it comes to violence against young Black people mostly is the Parliamentary Committee on Inquiry on Assassinated Youth report, which was written in 2016. And after a year of investigation, statements, and denunciation from the movement, experts and academics, and mothers of the victims of the violence against the Black youth, they state, so Brazilian government, the Senate, right? They wrote in the report that there is no other conclusion but the fact that there is a genocide against young Black people happening in Brazil. So the Brazilian government, wrote a document saying that there's genocide happening here, but there is just silence. Nothing was done about it. So I think that's very important to say that, because the Black movement has been saying that for decades, that there is a genocide against Black people here in the country. Also, and then how the changing politics scenario for Black people, our situation just have worsened. So, for example, in the first semester of 2020, 99 children and teenagers were murdered as victims of state violence. So this is something that it's insane, to hear that 99 children were murdered, and this data is from Rio, in fact, from police operation in the communities that killed 99 children. And also, I put here the children of Belfort Roxo. So these 3 young Black boys, they disappeared in the community. Nobody knows where they are at. And they're just, there are 3 Black boys, and they disappeared. And also, another thing that has been happening a lot here, and as a strategy of social control, is the mass incarceration of Black and poor, which is pretty much very similar to the context of the US. And last year, what we saw was an increase of denunciation of people who were sentenced, condemned, and they were in jail and all of that, accused of crime that they did not commit. And what's the scariest thing is, for example, this guy on the picture, the victim said that his voice was similar to the person who committed the crime at the time. And based on that, he was sentenced on for 8 years in jail, So we saw that a lot, from the last year. I think that has escalated a lot, like denunciation of families, friends, saying that, oh, that person, that Black boy was somewhere, and then he was accused of robbery when there was impossible that he was the person who committed the crime because, he was like far away, he was traveling or anything like that. And then I move forward to the political violence against Black women. And I think one thing that is important to say is that these women, just like Marielle Franco, they have been victims of political violence also because of what they represent. So Marielle, that happened to her because she was a Black woman, and also because of what she was working with, as Damian brought in his statement. And here, Black women represent 27% of the Brazilian population. So we are the biggest populational group. And so we see, especially from 2015 to now, there is this increase in the Black women's movement became more powerful and political present in the national scenario, I would say. So we had our first meeting happened in 1988. So that was the first time that Black women from all over the country united in Rio de Janeiro, to talk about the issues concerning racial and gender discrimination, right? So as you saw, when I speak about dictatorship, I don't mention Black women because there is a lack of documents mentioning Black women in the dictatorship, right? So that's just so how invisible we have been, right? And then another important mark in our, in the political participation of Black women in the nation is the March against Racism, Violence, and for the Wellbeing in 2015. In that period of time, we united around 20,000 Black women. They marched in the streets of Brasilia, demanding the end of racism, discrimination, violence against Black youth, because we also talk about mothers who are mourning their sons. And also, we always say that Black women occupy the bottom of the social pyramid. So we're talking about gender and racial discrimination, right? So because of the double discrimination that we face, we only represent 2% of the National Congress, and we are less than 1% in the House of Representative. I'm sorry. So here, I'm sorry. When we have women like Marielle occupying a space that is historically told that is not for us, we're not supposed to be there, right? It has been historically denied, right? So when we have women with such power occupying those places, speaking up and denouncing, we see how whiteness, react to us. So besides Marielle Franco, I also brought here other women who are in their political positions and dealing with death threats because they're Black women. So, for example, Erica Hilton, she's a councilwoman. She was elected in last year's election, and she's facing death threats, and she was the one who got the most votes, and she's also a trans woman, right? Councilwoman Carol Yara, she had her house, people like president shot at her house, right? It was her and her mom in the house at the time, and she was also elected last year. Mayor Suelen Rosin, she's the first Black woman elected mayor in Bauru, which is a city in the countryside of the state of São Paulo. And she's also suffering with death threats as well. And the federal deputy, Thalida Petroni, she has requested for the UN, protection for her life, because she's also dealing with death threats. So that's what we see as reaction, right? When we occupy space that we are not supposed to, right? And then here to finish my my statement, I brought some strategies of resistance that we have been doing. So at SEARCH, which is the Center of Studies of Labor Relations and Inequalities, we have this program called Prosecution, and the idea is that so the students, we have editions. We are in the 3rd edition right now, and it's for graduate students. They receive scholarships. They have mentoring, English classes, computer classes. And we also support them to access the formal labor market. And that's a strategy of answering to the society and to the state that we don't solve the social equalities and racial equalities that we have in the country with violence and security policies. We need education and opportunities in the labor market for the Black youth, right? Also, a very important political movement in Brazil right now with the Black Coalition for Rights. It was created right after Bolsonaro's election. And since then, we have been promoting national and international advocacies, parades, debates, denouncing the racism that Black people have historically faced here. We are also, in this moment of the pandemic, we have been pushing the debate on access to vaccination and to the emergency aid for Black people, because we know that here we are the majority of the population who are struggling with unemployment, who are dying from COVID as well, and so on. And the last, but not less important, is the legacy of Marielle Franco. One of the biggest things in her legacy is the fact that after she was murdered, we see more and more trans and Black women, LGBTQ women and Black, candidating themselves, for political positions, So we see they as like mayors, House of Representatives, Councilwomen. So that's very important because, for example, last year, 50% of the candidates were Black women. So that's very important because we are fighting, for power and the dispute of narrative, not only in the grassroots movement, but inside of the institutions, in the structure of power of the state. Thank you.
Sada, thank you very much, and thank you for sharing your important work. We will hear from Joelle Northam, and Ilion will be translating Joelle's talk into Portuguese. Joelle Northam is an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation and the Answer Coalition. He has worked in the struggle against police terrorism since the Black Lives Matter movement took shape, and is active in anti-war struggles, building international solidarity that links oppressed nations' people with the US to countries that are targeted by US imperialism. And Joelle is speaking from Denver, Colorado. Welcome, Joelle.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak on this panel today. It is truly an honor to be among you all. Just want to salute the Brazilian Black Coalition for Rights, Defend Democracy in Brazil, and the People's Forum, and anybody else who I forgot for putting this on. I also want to give a shout out. I don't know if she's going to see this recording or not, to Marielle Franco. I just want to uplift your resilience and your determination to seek justice for Marielle and to improve the conditions of Black people in the favelas and elsewhere. If you see this, I stand with you, and our struggles are kindred. Again, my name is Joelle Northam. I'm in the Denver branch of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Like Juliana mentioned, so the police And the local authorities here in the Denver area who have brought unwanted attention to are wielding the so-called US justice system against myself and my comrades. On September 17th of last year, multiple Denver area police forces led a coordinated series of arrests against local anti-racist organizers. Several activists were rounded up and taken to jail. 4 PSL members and another activist who we work closely with. 3 of us, my comrade Lillian, my comrade Eliza, and myself were then held in jail for 8 days. We are now being hit with a slew of false, very serious charges related to peaceful, nonviolent, very wholesome, family-friendly protests, which we led over the course of last summer, demanding justice for Elijah Mclean, who was a young Black man who was murdered by Aurora police officers in August of 2019. So if you are unfamiliar with the case, Elijah Mclean was a 23-year-old Black man who was killed while walking home in his own neighborhood. He was unarmed, not committing any crime, and not suspected of committing any crime. Someone called the police to report someone who looked suspicious because Elijah was dancing to music while he was walking, and he had a mask on, which he wore for blood circulation because he was anemic. The caller specifically stated that they did not believe he was dangerous, but nonetheless, 3 Aurora police officers, Aurora is it's like a suburb of Denver, the city that I'm currently in. But the police officers rolled up on Elijah, and within moments, they had forced him to the ground using a now banned chokehold on him. The 3 cops knelt on Elijah's 140-pound handcuffed body, and they tortured him for over 15 minutes, even at one point threatening to have police dogs attack him, while Elijah suffered, vomited, and he begged for his life. And yet, apparently unsatisfied with how dominated Elijah was, the police then directed paramedics to inject Elijah with ketamine, which is a horse tranquilizer. They shot him with a dose large enough to sedate a man twice his size, triggering multiple cardiac arrests. Between the massive dose of ketamine and the physical abuse of the officers, Elijah lost his life. Despite the fact that the assaulting officers' body-worn cameras all conveniently fell off, the entire scene is caught on video. And yet the district attorney, his name is Dave Young, he declined to charge any of the officers who killed Elijah. The officers weren't even taken off the job. One of the 3 killers has since been fired for a different offense involving a photo scandal mocking Elijah's death. The other 2 cops who killed Elijah are still active duty police officers. So we have been protesting Elijah's murder alongside his family and other community members since it first happened in August of 2019. But his case really didn't gain any traction or significant media attention until this past summer, 2020, when the police murder of George Floyd lit off the mass uprising that swept the entire country. And so we all saw how Denver had huge numbers of people in the streets from the beginning. But Aurora, the suburb of Denver, was still pretty much untouched until we decided to call a march there on June 27th, demanding justice for Elijah Mclean and criminal charges against his killers. So then, by the time the protest was held, people all around the country and even around the world were learning about Elijah's story. On the day of the action, more than 5,000 people turned out, including several national major media outlets. We marched on the highway, signaling that we were prepared and capable of bringing business as usual to a halt over the injustices in our city. This demonstration alone was groundbreaking in Aurora. But we didn't stop there. Through this entire summer, we continued to lead a mass, nonviolent, sustained protest movement, the likes of which Aurora has never seen. We had taken over highways and we led massive car protests with hundreds of cars. We led a 5-mile march uniting the cities of Denver and Aurora and calling for justice for the local victims of police terror. Millions of people now know Elijah Mclean's name, and the district attorney, Dave Young, his office has been flooded, he's no longer the district attorney, but it had been flooded with the demand to prosecute Elijah's killers. The president of the police union in Aurora told the press that the police department was facing a severe crisis of morale with record numbers of cops quitting or retiring. So all of that combined, this is why we, myself and my comrades, are being targeted. We have built a movement that is truly shaking the establishment here. The attack against us was a highly calculated effort involving months of surveillance, spearheaded by the district attorney, and involving several local police departments and another neighboring district attorney. They have not seen a movement of this magnitude before, and as a result, they are acting like a predator that's been backed into a corner and on their back foot, but still very dangerous. The unwillingness of local, state, and federal authorities to provide relief for people during the pandemic and the resultant growing disaffection thereof, combined with growing calls to defund the police, who are the guardians of the capitalist system, has produced for racist political establishments everywhere a sense of being besieged. So it has been truly incredible to be a part of this movement, to be in the streets with the people of Aurora and Denver as they stood up against the brutality and the impunity of the cops who patrol our streets. The Aurora Police Department is notorious for its viciousness and brutality, and the people here they've said enough is enough. Thousands of people stayed in the streets for months throughout the summer, continuing to fight even in the face of intimidation and brute force. The kind of movement truly threatened the impunity of the police, and they were well aware of it. So here we are, months out from our arrests back in September, knowing that from our very first protest in Aurora, the police were closely surveilling us, working to build a case that would shut down these protests against them. The charges they came up with, all tied to peaceful protests over a number of months, are some of the most extreme charges in the country. Those arrested, my comrade Lillian, my comrade Eliza, and myself are being hit with particularly extreme charges. We are being charged many times over with inciting riots, directing riots, or engaging in riots. There were no riots that happened in any of our protests, as well as obstructing government operations, whatever that means, attempting to influence a public agent, and the particularly outrageous attempted first-degree kidnapping charge. They charged us for kidnapping for holding a protest outside of a police station. So in total, I myself have been charged with 23 crimes, including 11 felonies, all attached to these protests. My comrade Lillian with nearly the same number, and our comrade Eliza is also facing several felonies and misdemeanors as well. And the other activists arrested are battling felonies and misdemeanors as well. If convicted and given the max, I could serve as many as 40 years in prison, and not one of these charges is valid. So we're being targeted not because we committed any crimes, but because we've been able to build a movement that is exposing the criminality of those in power. That's it. And this attack is designed not just to take out the leadership of these protests, but to strike fear in the movement as a whole, demonstrating the police and the DA's power to arbitrarily abduct, imprison, and charge activists who engage in protests against them. Every element of this attack on us has been designed to inflict the highest degree of fear. If you could take us off the street, then a lot of people will probably not want to come out to protests anymore, right? Our arrests on September 17th were carried out in a highly sensational and public manner. They brought an armored vehicle and a SWAT team to arrest me. Coincidentally, these are like the same armored vehicles that the US government has exported to Brazil. So they pounded on my door. They refused to show me a warrant. I was on the phone with my lawyer, who advised me to give myself up without seeing a warrant, because she was genuinely concerned that the police were going to bust down my door and kill me. I was then dragged out of my apartment with all the neighbors watching. So after that arrest, the three of us, me and my other comrades, were then taken and jailed and deliberately denied our right to see a judge for 8 days. And we were held in COVID-exposed jail units under 23-hour lockdown in awful, atrocious, degrading conditions, with no information as to why we're being held for so long or when we would be released. It was only thanks to the immense political and legal pressure generated by the movement here, as well as internationally, honestly, that we were finally released. But the authorities who contrived this attack severely miscalculated. This movement, the movement that we saw last summer, it's not easily swayed, and we have shown that we have the organizational capacity to withstand these repressive attacks and fight back as a movement. But the fact remains that this was just the beginning of our battle, and we have a long and serious fight ahead of us. So, as we've seen in multiple cities in the country, this is not an isolated struggle. The forces of the state across this country are leading a coordinated assault on protest leaders intended to crush the movement that sprung up this past summer that has shaken the very centers of ruling class power in the United States. So it has been calculated that as many as 26 million people took part in the protests last year in some 2,500 cities and towns in the first few weeks following George Floyd's killing. Imagine the fear, just imagine the fear of the police and the ruling class that they serve when seemingly overnight a movement took shape which shook the ruling class centers of power and caused great shifts in consciousness here. This vast movement reaching all corners of the country, uniting people of every age and nationality, anchored in the resistance of Black working class young people, in many ways represents an early form of what a revolutionary movement in this country could look like. We're not there yet, but truly you can make a revolution with 26 million people. While maybe the people of this country don't grasp this, the political leaders and the ruling class in this country does. And that is why, they're cracking down with such fervor against us. We had a presidential election last year. We don't really look toward the Biden administration with any hope or relief. Joe Biden is part of the same ruling class establishment that is threatened by any movement of working class power. He has made it explicit that he aligns with Donald Trump on his approach toward protests. And he intends to prosecute protesters with the full force of his administration, just like Trump. Likewise, here in Denver and Aurora, the case against us was lost with the combined effort of a Democratic and a Republican district attorney, demonstrating how both parties of the ruling class in this country are united in their determination to crush our movement. But on our side, we have the whole of the working class. We have every poor and oppressed person who has an interest in fighting this unjust system, in ending the impunity of the police and protecting our right to resist. And if we are to defeat these charges and any attack against our progress, we have to unite in defense of one another. This will be an important lesson for the struggle ahead when the movement is certain to face more repression. And, we shouldn't be discouraged by repression. We should expect repression, that as we grow as a force that represents a real threat to this unjust system, the ruling class will lash out in many ways to try and stop us. What counts is how we respond to it as a movement, whether we are able to not just overcome it, but even use it to drive forward the struggle. So even more frightening to those at the helm of international finance capital is an international movement which links the struggle against racism in the United States with the struggle against racism in other parts of the world, and countries that are allied with the US and thus are links in the chain of global finance capitalism and imperialism. Black struggle, the Black revolt everywhere has always been the biggest threat to the system. And that's why the repressive police forces from Denver to Aurora to Rio have invested so much time, money, and resources to suppress our legitimate aspirations for liberation. So in the spirit of Pan-African international solidarity, we must work just as hard against those repressive forces as they work against us. And we must always find a way to uplift and support our respective localized struggles. So salute to you all in Brazil and elsewhere. That is my time. I will wrap here. But again, I just want to say many thanks for holding this event and giving me the opportunity to connect with the struggle in Brazil and discuss how we can defeat these attacks on our people so that we can continue to push forward stronger in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, everyone. It's really interesting to see you all approaching these topics from such different perspectives, but also bringing up very similar themes. I think something that you all have touched upon is the role of the judiciary and law in all of this. Oh, and I apologize, Natalia is now translating for us. I will be better about remembering that. So you've talked about, in some ways, the benefits of the judiciary or international law in aiding either activists or specific political projects. And on the other hand, the way in which political violence is enacted through the misuse of law and what we call in Brazil, lawfare. And I think us at Defend Democracy in Brazil have been thinking a lot about, you know, former President Lula's recent release from his charges and restoration of his political rights. And this kind of brings to the forefront how the law is misused to prosecute political activists. So I'm kind of interested in hearing from you all. What are some of the ways in which you see the judiciary and legislation aiding political activist work, and some of the ways that you see it hindering? And what does this mean for democracy, both in Brazil and in the US? I don't know if anyone wants to catch that and start, or if we should go in the order that we. Joel, do you want to?
I can start.
Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. In the US, I mean, the police and, you know, the judiciary, the courts, like there really isn't much of a distinction between them in terms of you know, their attempts to block, you know, like the liberation aspects of the people and to actually block justice. You know, in the US, there's a lot of, you know, it's doublethink. We call it the justice system, but they seldom deliver justice, especially if, you know, people victimized are Black, and especially if the victimizers are agents of the state. And so like within the US, you know, like the courts, you know, the DAs, the prosecutors, like they're, you know, and the cops, like they're very enmeshed with one another. So yeah, like I think that's not to say that like every single sort of institutional milieu, like especially internationally, like might not be able to provide support. Like I remember one of Malcolm X's latest projects, but you know, before he was assassinated, was petitioning to the United Nations, and you know that was one of his latest, one of his last acts as a political activist. And I think even now, like or very recently, you have you know, people in Chicago that have been, you know, finding legal ways and institutional ways to address the concerns as Black people. But for the most part, like, you know, it's an entire complex of oppression involving the police, the courts, all courts, the local, the state, the federal courts. So yeah.
Sada or Damien, do you want to add anything?
Jump in.
Didn't hear the. I was just going to ask you to repeat the question. I'm sorry, Damien. Just okay. I had a connection issue. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem, Sada.
Damien, go ahead.
Oh, do you mind if I just repeat the question, Damien? That way Sada can be thinking. Okay. Sada, I was kind of asking you all to think of, or if you could explain how you see legislation and the judiciary either helping or hindering political work, in the sense that we have seen some of the ways in which legislation and political violence is enacted through the misuse of the law. But also you all spoke about some of the ways in which international agreements and certain legislation helps activists and helps protect activists. So if you could speak about the legislation and the judiciary either helping activists or not, and what that means for our democracy, both in Brazil and the US. Damien, sorry to interrupt you.
What sprung to mind in thinking about legislation and the rule of law in what I know about Rio? Well, to start with, you've got Lula's, the ruling, which is allowed Lula to run and basically has eliminated the charges against him. And I think what is going on that's so worrying in Brazil is this constant bending of the law to fit any purpose. So the rule of law itself constantly being undermined, because there was some good work done at the beginning of the Lava Jato investigation. But once they decided to weaponize it for political purposes, it not only had this devastating effect on helping to elect Bolsonaro, but it also undermined the actual good work, any good work that was being done against corruption. So I think when you always have this bending of the rule of law to fit anyone's purpose, that's when you're running into danger, which is what seems to be being applied in Joel's case as well, you know, stretching of the law in all its forms to persecute him and to stop his activities. And in terms of Rio, what I know about Rio and South America and generally, the war on drugs on a street level, so not really talking about activism, but talking as in a tool for criminalizing and oppressing poor communities. I don't know, I understand it's similar in the USA, but in Rio you have whole favelas controlled by gangs who derive their income from the drug trade, and police then fighting for dispute of these markets really, or manipulating these markets, you know, catching people, releasing people, taking bribes, even sometimes being involved in the business themselves. So I think also, as long as we have these illegal markets, we know the war on drugs has failed, but it seems to me that no one ever brings that to the table, and we need to bring that to the table. Like, how are these laws being used? Are they effective? And to an extent, you know, the police themselves, they aren't choosing these laws. Society is choosing these laws, and the police are just applying them, but they're leading to awful oppression of poor communities, black communities, the young, all over the world, not just in Rio. So I think that's something that always has to be looked at if we're to try and look at social progress and better rights for all as well. But Rio is a very extreme example, and it's important to understand that context, because that was the context that Marielle worked in. So we've got human rights violations on a day-to-day basis, huge numbers of extrajudicial executions. In 2019, there was 1,810. They're called resistance, acts of resistance in the state of Rio. So probably about 95% would have been in the urban Rio. That's 1,810 police killings. Most of them would have been extrajudicial executions, because that's the way it works. Everyone knows that. That's the standard practice. The police don't like arresting people. They'll often catch someone, and if that person has some monetary value, they're a high-level criminal, they will try and ransom them, or they'll even sell them to a rival. And if that doesn't work, then, or if it's a low-level person, they will execute them. And they've got these appalling levels of extrajudicial executions in the city. So Marielle was working in that context as well, denouncing what was going on. I think one of her last acts, like a few days before she died, was to talk about some police killings in favela of Acari. And this also helps us understand the rise of the militias in the city, are when police have decided, oh, we're going to stop fighting a gang in a community, and we're just going to take over the whole community ourselves, and we're going to exploit it, not just for the drug trade, which we're going to pretend to eliminate, but we're going to start charging for all services to that community. So to get back to the beginning of the question, if you have these illegal markets and laws that can be bent, misapplied, or you have all this power given to the police on the street, you know, to decide whether I kill this person, whether I sell this person, you're going to have chaos on a street level. So we also need to look at the laws, and that's a society-wide question as well. Hope that answer wasn't too long.
Sara, do you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. I'll be very brief. I'm sorry. Yes, I agree with Damien and Joan, and also I think that sometimes not the law is not the problem. You know, for example, Brazil, we have very good laws and advanced laws, in fact, especially when it comes to social, how we use the law, right? And who are we talking about? You know, so depending on the issue, depending, like when we discuss like whose life matters, right? I think that's when the issue starts. So depending on if you are discussing racism, for example, in the judiciary, it's almost ineffective. It's very rare for us to have a sentence in which the person is guilty for racism crime. You know what I mean? So I think the problem is the institutional racism and how the people who run the institution, you know, deals with the law, right? So I think that's the main issue, because the law is very important for us to have something to hold on, as a sub-side, so international law, international agreements, national laws are very important because we have, how to argue and say, no, this is not fair, this is wrong, this is a human rights violation or anything like that. But also we need to change the institutions in order, for, so we have justice, for everybody, not just for some people. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see some questions coming in, which I will read soon. If you have any other questions, please post them in our Q&A or on YouTube, and Rita is collecting those. I think Natalia will translate next. And so another question I have for all three of you before I read some of the questions coming in from our public is, how do you see us moving forward, right? So I think both Brazil and the US have seen, a deep political divide, high levels of hatred that's kind of stemmed from just racism and all sorts of misunderstandings of inequalities. But at the same time, you guys are speaking of so much potential, right? You're speaking about the potential that Marielle kind of had. You're speaking about these other politicians who are coming and taking her place. And Joelle, you're talking about just this beautiful movement of people in the streets, right? And so how do you see us moving forward? How can we get past this hate and this divide that has been so violent and that has been so damaging, but maybe seeing change from now on? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in or begin.
I can start. It's a broad question and we could talk about it for hours. But I could say that the only thing that has really ever shook the foundations of a fundamentally racist system to its core has been the mass movement of people, and it takes individuals organizing collectively and consciously intervening into micro struggles, against racism in all its manifestations. And then in winning those little micro struggles, it's like momentum, and it's like a snowball effect. These things have a snowball effect that only gets greater and greater and greater and greater in response to, these real world conditions. Racism is really strong, and it's institutionalized and it's seen every day. And the violence that we see every day from sunup to sunup. Police terrorism is not the only expression of violence in this system. Poverty is violence. Black people face record poverty. Hunger is violence. Unemployment is violence. Being denied healthcare coverage is violence. And I think that we have to sort of shift our orientation to recognize that, us organizing collectively against these, any and all of these forms of violence as a result of the system, that's the only way that we're going to be able to stop it, right? It has to be a collective conscious effort involving people coming together and making it happen. And I think that's why organizations are important. That's why the Brazilian Black Coalition for Rights is important. That's why Defend Democracy is important. That's why PSL is important. It should be taboo at this point to believe that we can actually throw a wrench into the system that is destroying our people without any sort of organization, right? And I think that's where it starts. It's taking on these micro struggles and having it become a snowball effect to take on the larger struggle against, racist institutions in our respective localities.
Thank you. Damien and Sarah, do you want to say anything? Sarah, go ahead.
Yes, I can say. Also, one thing that I would add is education. I'm a stronger believer in education, in not only the traditional education, meaning schools and all of that, but conversations. And I do believe that sometimes it's small, small groups and small group, it's a small work, and to talk. We, especially here in Brazil, which is very different in the US, but here we need to more and more talk about racial relations. We need to be open to sit down at the table and talk about racism and how that affects not only Black people, but also white people, you know. Also, I also believe in the diversity. We need to promote diversity in the structures of power, you know, so private institutions, we need to have more diversity there, right? We need to have more diversity in the public sector and all of that, you know. So the more diversity we have, we will be able, you know, to change the structures of power, you know, and understand that it's not okay, that the violence of what people deal with are not okay, right? So the unemployment and the lack of access, the lack of access to the healthcare system, you know, or, you know, the police brutality that we deal with, you know, they are not okay, you know. So I think it's a work of bringing awareness, and we need white people to step up as well. You know, I think it's about time that white people need to talk about whiteness and white privilege and what they're going to do with it. You know, I think that's a very necessary conversation, because it's not only Black people's issue, right? We are talking about societies, right? So that's I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Damien, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think solidarity is super important, and mobilization. I think that especially in the case of Marielle, that's what made all the difference, because I think when whoever was behind the killing undertook it, I think they thought it would blow over fairly quickly. And I think it was the one real thing that made the difference was the response. So if you saw the scenes the day after, when her coffin was brought to the councillor's office in Rio, you know, the huge crowd that gathered, that was a really strong sign that Rio society, to begin with, wasn't going to accept it. And then that very quickly spread. And I think it was that mobilization and that scrutiny that led to the initial framing attempt, you know, to find a false assassin and to set up a whole false narrative about what happened, collapsed under that scrutiny. And it wouldn't have without that. So solidarity and mobilization, I say always. And then also to try and look at what's not discussed, which is how I discovered the power of the Jogo do Bicho, racketeers and clans, was because it had never been discussed. And I thought, oh, this thing's always here, why is it not discussed? Oh, I'll go and find more. So also to look into the social silences, like what are people being silent about as well?
Thank you. So we have questions that are kind of specific to each one of you. I'm going to read them, and then maybe you can answer the one that pertains to you. Joelle, there are two questions for you. One is if you could say more about the armed tanks and how they were, these tanks that are being exported from the US to Brazil, if you know more about that. And then also if Joelle, John Rayleigh from the LGBT radio program is asking if any of your PSL members are LGBTQI, and if that's played any special role in the repression in the same way that it did with Marielle Franco. A question from Mariana for Damien is that your research book points to the major organized crime network that is extremely close to government and police force in Brazil, might be connected to Marielle's murder, but beyond that, to a violence that can't be disconnected from the ongoing genocide against poor Black youth. What kind of ways do you see when talking about organized crime, since the police forces and military seem to be so close to these networks, how exactly do you bring that to the table effectively or constructively? Is that possible? And if you guys want to see these questions, they're in the Q&A. And a final question from Mariana for both Joelle and Sara is, you're both on the front lines of the movement for Black Lives Matter and against police brutality in Brazil and in the US. Can international solidarity contribute further to the advancement of your agendas, and how so? know that was a lot to take in all at once.
I was actually just writing down some of these questions.
Okay. Does anyone want
Okay.
to? Joel, you want to start us off? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Just a question about like the armored vehicles. So, I mean, the U.S. has exported arms to Brazil in the past, but they have also encouraged Brazil to have its own arms industry and export its own arms elsewhere around the world. I think at one time, I think maybe around sometime in the 80s, I think Brazil was like number 5 in arms exports in the world. But more recently speaking, in March of 2019, y'all's defense minister, Fernando, I think his name is, I'm going to butcher this name, Fernando Azevedo e Silva, that's not that bad. He came to Washington, D.C. and met with Trump. They sat down, they shook hands, they basically reaffirmed their cooperation on defense issues. And I use defense in parentheses because when you have two right-wing governments collaborating on defense, that usually means offense toward either other nations or oppressed nations, people within their respective countries. They reaffirmed their cooperation on defense issues, research and development, technological security. So they had this agreement that they signed. I think it was called the Technology Safeguards Agreement or something that was signed back in 2016. But this guy came to DC in March, and they basically reaffirmed their defense cooperation. And then later that September 2019, the U.S. donated 30 armored vehicles to the Brazilian military, to Brazil, in that September. And I'm not sure exactly, I'm not a technical specialist. I'm not sure exactly what kind of armored vehicle it was, but it was 30 armored vehicles that were donated to Brazil then. And these are the same vehicles that I see in pictures from Brazil, they're just rolling into favelas. That was the same thing that they used when they pulled up on me. So, yeah. Should I answer all the questions that I was asked right now, or?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Okay.
Somebody asked the question about other PSL members that are LGBTQI, and whether that plays a role. That's played a role in this particular case. I think that was a question. So to answer your question, yes, PSL has many comrades in it that are LGBTQ, and none of the comrades who are dealing with this case right now are, but around the country, in some states where state governments are trying to roll back the gains made by LGBTQI people, things, it's particularly trans people, gender affirming surgery, things of that nature. They're constantly always trying to roll back the gains of the LGBTQ community here. And so our comrades are spearheading the fight against that and mobilizing, in cities and states where that's happening. We, as comrades who do not identify as LGBTQIA, as part of being in this organization, we lend them, of course, the same support, the same struggle, as I would with an issue that such as racism in my case as a Black American. So yes, to answer your question, absolutely. And then I want to address this last question about international solidarity. Can international solidarity contribute to the struggles that we're facing in the US and Brazil? The answer to that question is unequivocally, it's yes, right? Yes, absolutely. International solidarity it's crucial. It is literally, it is our fourth sword. It is the one thing that the ruling classes in our respective countries fear the most. And to give you an example of that, so in the US, in the 60s and 70s, one of our main domestic intelligence agencies, the FBI, launched a counterintelligence program known as Cointelpro, which was responsible for disrupting the activities of radical movements in the country, the Black Power movement, the American Indian movement, the anti-war movement. And for the Black Power movement specifically, one of their stated objectives was to prevent coalitions of Black people inside the United States with Black people abroad. anywhere in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and the motherland itself. And even not just Black people abroad, but other oppressed nations people that are fighting imperialism abroad. They had to sever that connection. The last thing that they want is for oppressed nations people in the United States linking up in solidarity with oppressed nations people abroad. It's one of the last things that they can't stand. Us recognizing our kinship with them is a nightmare for them. So yeah, I'm just gonna wrap that.
Thank you, Joel. Sada or Damien? And Natalia will be doing the translating from now on.
Okay. Thank you, Juliana. Yes, international solidarity, just like Joel said, is super, super, super important. And as I mentioned in the beginning of my statement, about the dictatorship, the biggest fear of the state was Black Brazilians engaging with African Americans, right, in the context of the civil rights movement. And even into today, when I travel abroad, especially to the US, a lot of people don't even know that there's Black people here and that we are the biggest Black population outside Africa, right? So I think the international solidarity is super, super fundamental for us, to engaging in the Black Brazilian struggle and sharing that abroad, whatever you are, that's very important. Connecting with organizations, Black organizations here who are doing work, for example, the Black Coalition for Rights, I'm sorry, and CERT as well. And also, I think here in Brazil, we have the language is a barrier for us. We are a Portuguese-speaking country, right? So also, I always say that translation, interpreter, it's very, very important for us to connect. Language is power as well. So these are the three things that I would like to point.
Damien, thank you, Sada.
Quickly, in response to Mariana's question, how do you, the organized crime networks that are very powerful, how do they link into the genocide against the marginalized Black urban youth or youth generally? It's hard to say because that's facilitated, that genocidal violence is facilitated by sort of deep-rooted fears in Brazilian society. You have the good thug is a dead thug saying bandido bom e bandido morto, which means that there's a high societal acceptance of killings and that certain groups are seen as discardable, especially young Black youth, young or favela youth. So that to sort of untangle that from the whole organized crime networks that sort of support lawlessness is very difficult. But from my point of view, like technically speaking, if you start removing the illegal markets, so you can't have a massive illegal gambling market without undermining rule of law. You can't have massive drugs markets without undermining rule of law. So until there's a coherent discussion about removing those from illegality and bringing them into the formal markets, you're not going to have many changes in the way that organized crime is linked in to this structural violence, because they work together, and you have to start unpicking them. And it's difficult because they're talking about legalizing drugs, decriminalizing drugs is something society doesn't want to do, but they need to be addressed if you're going to have sort of coherent progress.
Thank you, Damien. I feel like we could keep talking and I could keep listening to you for ages. Our time is up. Thank you so much to the three of you, Damien, Joel, and Sada, for speaking to us and for sharing your important work. I have put on the chat links to your sites, but if you have other links that people should access, please just put that in for people. I want to thank the People's Forum staff, particularly Rita and Mary, who are in the backstages of our event today and were essential help. Thank my fellows at Defend Democracy in Brazil, the committee in New York, especially Natalia and Ilion, who are doing the very tough job of translating. And so also thank our supporters, but thank the Instituto Marielle Franco and I hope that we can continue these conversations and continue moving forward. And yes, thank you very much.
It's been an honor. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and very nice to meet you all.